All right, so it looks like we are live on Facebook. We started recording, so I want to welcome everybody. Thank you all for joining this evening's event, Israel's new travel restrictions and how they will impact Palestinian Americans and others. My name is Chris Habibi. I am the Legislative and Policy Coordinator for the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, or ADC. For those of you who haven't heard of us before, ADC is a national grassroots Arab American civil rights organization. We were founded in 1980 and have been advocating for our communities ever since. Tonight's discussion of the new COGAT rules is a really important piece of the work that ADC, along with many other organizations, have been doing on the issue of Israel's inclusion into the visa waiver program. ADC has had ongoing conversations with the Department of Homeland Security, who are the executive department in charge of the visa waiver program. And we have repeatedly stressed that the treatment of Arab and specifically Palestinian Americans must be that the equal treatment must be in place before any decision is made. I'm looking forward to this evening's event. I know that we will have a very informative discussion about these new rules and what they might mean for those of us who want to travel to the occupied West Bank. In a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Zana Hutchinson, an incredible advocacy officer with the Defense for Children International Palestine, who will be moderating this discussion. But I wanted to take a moment just to introduce our two fantastic speakers, Zaha Hassan and Maya Berry. Zaha is a human rights lawyer and a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Her research focus is on Palestine-Israel peace, the use of international legal mechanisms by political movements, and U.S. foreign policy in the region. Previously, she was a coordinator and senior legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team during Palestine's bid for UN membership, and was a member of the Palestinian delegation to quartet-sponsored exploratory talks between 2011 and 2012. Maya Berry is the executive director for the Arab American Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan national civil rights advocacy organization founded to nurture and encourage direct participation in our political and civic life. In 1996, she established AAI's first government relations department, which she led for 5 years before becoming legislative director for House Minority Whip David Bonoir, where she managed the congressman's legislative strategy and developed policies on international relations, human rights, and so many other incredible topics. Maya currently serves as the co-chair of the Hate Crimes Task Force at the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights. She's on the board of Public Citizen and the Bayard Rustin Democracy Fellowship Program, a project of the Democracy Initiative. Zaina, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Chris. First of all, thank you so much, Maya and Zaha, for being here. This whole thing came about because of the multitude of questions that kept coming from friends and family all over once this was released. In February 2022, Israel's Coordinating Office for Government Affairs in the Territories, otherwise known as COGAT, the Israeli Defense Ministry's military administration responsible for issuing orders and policies concerning entry of foreign nationals to the occupied Palestinian territories, published a 97-page ordinance that detailed various travel restrictions. Now, there have always been these restrictions, or not necessarily the same exact one, but there have always been restrictions, written and unwritten. But this seems that it's taking it further and complicates the process and its enforcement. But we all know that Palestinians living under occupation and apartheid are subjected to continuous issues with freedom of movement. So, but at this point, this extends beyond that, and it's a lot more complicated than it was originally. So based on all the questions that we've gotten on a personal note, we've decided to hold this panel, and thank you, Maya and Zaha, for taking the time to be here to answer the questions and go deeper into this really, really important topic. So before we start, just to go quick overview of how this is going to go. We will discuss the COGAT ordinance with Zaha, the implications of the visa waiver program with Maya, but also we want to talk about quick action items for you all, because this is not just about the problem with the language. We need the support of the public. We need your support to move the US government on this. And this is the advocate person in me, the activist and advocate person in me that is talking right now. So we will go over them briefly, but to start, once this is over, this program is over, we will be sending a follow-up email. And in the follow-up email, you're going to have a couple of action items, if you will. The first one, and they're going to be primarily from ADC, but we will try to collect others and send as well. The first one, we will need your stories, at least in the, entry and attempted entries into Palestine or the Palestinian territories in East Jerusalem. If you have had issues in the past, whether you have been denied entry, whether you have been returned or you've experienced harassment of any kind, you will have the possibility to write them down and send the form into the ADC. But also moving forward, particularly after the implementation of these new COGAT rules, we want to collect all the stories and as much information as we possibly can, because we're not just the numbers that are relayed back and forth in order for Israel to be admitted into this waiver program or for any other reason. People's stories matter. And in order for us to be able to advocate on this issue, we need to hear from you. We need to hear from everyone who is facing issues with this. Initially, this was supposed to take place, these rules were supposed to take place on, I believe, May 22nd or 24th, but now it's been postponed, and Zeha, I think we'll speak about that further, into early July. The second is, so, between now and then, it's also important that we hear from you, but also after the July 5th implementation. Hopefully we can prevent this, but you never know. The second really important action item will be, and we welcome this not just on this issue, but in general, is to contact your representatives, and we'll detail that in the email as well. We need you all to contact your representatives and explain to them why this is an important issue for you, why as American citizens, why you're being discriminated against, why there are so many restrictions that we're going to learn more about, and let them be aware of what's going on. Don't be intimidated by in terms of contacting your representatives. It's extremely important. We pay their salaries, and they represent us in Congress. And in order for them, we should let them know how we feel in order for them to represent us properly. But more information on that will be sent out in an email. And now I'm going to go into the official part of this meeting. So, but before we start, I want to put a disclaimer here, underlined and highlighted, that this is a webinar for information purposes only, and to share the opinions of the experts who are working on this. This is not legal advice, so please note that the information given on this call may change by the Israeli government or otherwise, with or without notice. So any information that's given, any questions that are answered, are specific to this call, and it's our opinion based. Please make sure to note that. So we're going to start with Zeha. Chris kindly did the introduction for the personal introduction, but Zeha will be talking about will be giving a summary presentation of the updated COGAT ordinance, which contains new processes and procedures that American travelers have to abide by. The rules will mainly impact Palestinian Americans, but also those who want to visit and stay in the occupied Palestinian territories in East Jerusalem. I'm going to turn it over to you, Zeha, and please go ahead. Thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, Zaina, and thanks to Chris and the ADC for organizing this webinar. As Zaina said, the purpose of this is to really inform anyone planning to travel to the occupied West Bank about the new almost 100 pages of COGAT rules, and to share with you things that we're hearing and that we're learning about it, and to discuss the policy implications. To be honest, there are more questions than answers at this point. So we also hope that folks who stand to be impacted by the ordinance will seek clarity from the State Department and from the relevant Israeli authorities, whether directly or through your member of Congress, as Zaina said. We also hope that you'll share your stories. Like Zaina said, this is really important for the administration to know how this is impacting Americans. And you can do that through organizations like ADC and AAI, who are both working on these issues. So what is this ordinance that you have all been hearing about? The COGAT ordinance, as Zaina said, was published in February, and it was supposed to be effective in May. But due to a lawsuit that was filed in 2019 concerning the old rules, the implementation has now been postponed from today. This court decision, this Israeli High Court decision came out today, postponing the implementation till July 5th. So we have more time to work on trying to get more answers about these rules. Much of the ordinance is not actually new. Most of the policies contained in it have been around for decades. Some of those policies were published, some were not. Some were implemented regularly, some were randomly implemented. Others were instituted purportedly because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but now they're being made permanent. And there are also some rules that are completely new. Now, the ordinance is supposed to be a two-year pilot rules, meaning that it's a trial basis. So we don't know what the purpose of this trial is or what success would look like. We will likely get more answers, I think, from this lawsuit. The fact that these written and unwritten policies are now being compiled in one ordinance and published in English indicates a clear intention to formalize them and to apply them more consistently without leaving much room for discretion with Israeli border officials. So who is affected by the rules of this ordinance? The ordinance impacts you if you plan to travel to the occupied West Bank and you have first-degree relatives who are Palestinian residents of the West Bank. A first-degree relative is a parent, child, or sibling whose center of living is the West Bank at the time of your visit, or who is in the area at the time of your visit. It affects you if you're seeking to stay in the West Bank areas under PA control. It affects you if you're a journalist who's staying in the West Bank, or if you're a college student or professor wanting to study or teach at a Palestinian university in the West Bank or in East Jerusalem. It affects you if you're doing business or working for an NGO or volunteering in the West Bank. And it, of course, affects you if you're someone who's trying to adjust their status so they could legally reside with their spouse in the West Bank. Now, if you are not one of the 6 categories of people I just described, then you are not allowed into the West Bank at all under these rules, unless you can get special permission that's granted for humanitarian reasons. So if you want to visit and stay with your cousin in the West Bank, you'll have to get special permission. And if your cousin isn't deathly ill or has some sort of exigent circumstance that's of a humanitarian nature, Israel may not be granting you the right to enter the West Bank to stay with your cousin. So what does this ordinance say about the different categories of travelers? What's required of them? So for first-degree family members, for business people, investors, or journalists, you have to apply 45 days in advance at an Israeli embassy or consulate in the US for pre-screening. Now, this pre-screening does not guarantee that you'll be allowed to enter. It only entitles you to show up at the Allenby crossing to apply for a visa. As a part of this pre-screening application, the traveler must provide the names and ID numbers of their family in the West Bank, the names and IDs of those who they will stay with or visit, and you have to disclose whether you own property in the West Bank or stand to inherit property. If you provide all this information and you manage to get cleared to travel to the Allenby crossing, then you'll only be allowed to enter through that Allenby crossing. You're not allowed to use the Ben Gurion Airport. Those approved for a visitor's visa at the crossing will have their passports then stamped, limited to Judea and Samaria area only. If the visitor defies the limits of this visa and goes to Jerusalem, for example, this could bar them from future entry. In all cases, visitors are not allowed to re-enter as a visitor for 9 months. So you can't come back, in a month or two because you want to visit. Now, for American college students or college professors, college students face a quota of 150 foreign nationals in the occupied territories at a time for study, and they're limited to certain subjects that they may pursue. They can only be there for a semester. Professors must have a postgraduate degree and are limited in how long they can stay and teach. If you're considered by COGAT, the Israeli military administrator, a distinguished researcher who holds a doctorate, you can stay for longer, but these people are subject to 100 persons at a time, and they must teach in specific fields that COGAT determines contributes significantly to academic learning or advances the economy of the area or concerns regional cooperation or peace. There is no opportunity for any other foreign hires or student exchanges or other types of educational experiences. Volunteers must also pre-apply to get in, and they can't stay for more than a year. And these are limited to people working for philanthropic, religious, or charitable organizations approved by Israel. For the purposes of family reunification, only spouses of Palestinian ID holders may apply to legally reside in the West Bank. A child or a parent is not permitted to apply for legal residency to stay with their family members in the West Bank. Until a decision is made on a spousal application, the spouse will have to obtain a 3-month tourist visa, which may only be renewed once. After that, the spouse would have to leave the country for 6 to 9 months, waiting for a decision to be made. And these decisions aren't made by disinterested bureaucrats. The ordinance says they're made by the political echelon. Now, this political echelon hasn't approved spousal applications for years upon years. And only recently was it announced that 4,000 new ID numbers would be issued to legalize spouses who've been waiting illegally in the West Bank for their applications to be processed. Now, if a spouse's application is denied, they may not use a visitor's visa again to stay in the occupied territories with their spouse. They would have to apply for special permission, which is temporary. And after that, they just don't get to live with their spouse. Now, who is not affected by this ordinance, this sort of parade of horrors? Anyone traveling to both the West Bank and Israel who has no family connection in the West Bank does not have to be pre-screened and can travel through any border crossing, whether Ben Gurion or Allenby. So basically, your garden variety tourist is exempted from these rules. Now, if you are visiting, studying, or teaching or doing business in Israeli settlements that are illegally in the West Bank, you are accepted from the COGAT rules and you can travel freely on any border crossing with no pre-screening, and you have no problems. So what is the purpose of these restrictions? I mean, it's clear on the face what's going on here, and it's what's undergirded Israel's policies in the West Bank since 1967. It's to track and restrict travel of foreign nationals to the West Bank that Israel deems are, undesirable. It's to control Palestinian population growth, and it's to keep data on the land claims of Palestinians holding foreign nationality because Israel has a settlement enterprise it's engaged in and wants to know who's got adverse interests to it. And of course, overarching all of this is the idea that Israel's trying to normalize its sovereignty over the entirety of the West Bank. And it's no longer treating Palestinians or others who are wanting to go to the West Bank as transiting through Israel. It's treating the West Bank as part of Israel, and it gets to determine who comes in and who doesn't. So why is Israel doing this? Why is it formalizing these policies and making it so blatant what's going on? And why are they requiring these pre-approval procedures for travel? I mean, the publishing of this massive ordinance in English is probably meant for the consumption of US officials who are trying to gain some kind of clarity about what Israel's entry requirements are as they consider whether Israel is eligible for the US visa waiver program, which Maya is going to be talking about. I do want to point out that the pre-screening process was something that was actually started during the COVID pandemic as a temporary measure. Despite Israel's relaxation of the pre-screening at the airport in Tel Aviv, the restrictions on entry through Allenby have persisted. If you look today at the US Embassy website, you'll see that it says that Americans without a PA-issued ID or passport must apply in advance to the Israeli government for a permit to enter the West Bank from Jordan via Allenby. The State Department has a link to the Israeli government website, which includes a copy of an application that must be filled out and sent to the Israeli embassy or consulate in the US. And now this application is very similar, if not the same. I didn't check it very closely, but it appears to be the same application that is now included in these new COGAT rules, and it requires information on one's land ownership and inheritance rights. Of course, these questions have nothing to do with preventing the spread of COVID. So I don't know how they slipped that question in during the COVID pandemic, but they actually existed before this new ordinance. I'll stop there and let Maya talk about how this all relates to the visa waiver program.
Thank you, Zaha, so much. There's many questions, and we'll be answering them later. And there's multiple different layers to this. It's sickening, and I want to shout out to Jeff in the chat for already being, calling it out and being ready to contact House of Representatives and senators. Please do that after this event. It's really important to hear from you. Second. Thank you, Zaha. Second topic, we'll be talking about the visa waiver program. Maya will discuss how Israel's eligibility for admission into the visa waiver program may be impacted by the new COGAT rules. Maya, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to you. And for all you do, I know you've been working really hard on this, so really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaina, and thank you, Zaha, that was incredibly thorough, and I trust you'll be answering all the questions today. Thank you, Chris and ADC, for including us. Regrettably, this is a topic that we should not be discussing, full stop. We have been working on collecting, and in fact, I apologize, I'm going to go ahead and paste it into the chat right now. There's a link to our reporting form that we have been using to collect information about Americans of Arab descent, specifically Palestinian Americans, Arab Americans, and others who've been advocates for Palestinian human rights. Their treatment at the their treatment at Israel's border for 4 decades now. So the idea that we are having this conversation is quite extraordinary. I wanted to sort of start there. The visa waiver program itself is pretty simple. It is a program that was piloted back in 1986 and then put in place permanently in the year 2000. The idea was that there are countries with which we could have certain agreements. They allow our citizens in, we allow theirs in for 90 days on a visitor visa without requiring the need to apply and receive a visa for that. There are currently 40 countries in the program. Israel's talked about joining it for some time. I'm pleased to say back then when it came up, because of the way that our community has documented these cases, we've had secretaries of state go on record officially, from Madeleine Albright to Condoleezza Rice and others, who have simply said, no, there are requirements that Israel cannot fulfill for the visa waiver program. And when they've talked about them, they've led with the idea and the fact that Israel continues to violate what we believe to be the equal protection laws protecting us at US borders. So with that, in the past, it's been a simple, quick conversation. Regrettably, that's not the case anymore. The conversations began to sort of change under the Trump administration and really took hold under the Biden administration. We've had comments from the president. We have had comments from Secretary of State Blinken. We've had comments from Secretary Mayorkas at the Department of Homeland Security. And the U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Tom Nides, has identified Israel's inclusion in the visa waiver program as his, one of his top priorities. What has changed since our previous secretaries of state have found Israel to be in violation of our rights and therefore not able to meet the requirements? Nothing at all. In fact, it's gotten worse. And that's what Zaha just presented to us. So when we talk about how the COGAT rules can impact this, I think it just further demonstrates why they do not belong in this program. To be clear, there are 8 different requirements that a country has to fulfill in order to join the visa waiver program. The 2 that Israel has a very real problem with, most of the other ones have to do with, the appropriate type of passport, electronic information. But the 2 that Israel has a real problem with are its visa refusal rate and its inability to issue reciprocity, the reciprocal rights to US citizens who would travel there. And that is our right to travel there and be treated equally as others. So with that, I just want to mention that the non-immigrant visa rate requirement from the program, and this is statutory language to be clear, this is public law, this exists in law, it's not the kind of thing you can arbitrarily change, is 3% or less. So in 2019, Israel's was 5.33%. In fiscal year 2020, it was 6.52%. We have some very real concerns that during the COVID period, everybody's refusal rate is lower because there were very few people traveling and entering our country. So there's some concern about how that might play out in this conversation. But I will tell you that we spend very little time talking about its refusal rate, because from our perspective, the top rule it must meet is reciprocity, and it cannot meet that. We've been, as I said, we have and others have been documenting these cases for a very long time. We're pretty confident that very little has changed since then. Regrettably, it's actually gotten worse. We all know the case in 2019 where two sitting members of Congress, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, were both denied entry. In addition to targeting Arab Americans, Palestinian Americans, and others who advocate for Palestinian human rights, there seems to be a potential ideological exclusion when it comes to those who support the movement to boycott Israel. With that, again, we've been told repeatedly by our own State Department when we've complained about the very cases that are appearing in the chat, and it's so disturbing to read these things, that a foreign country has a right to control its own borders. Correct. That is correct. Which is why when we attempted to make the case for equal protection, we kind of didn't get very far in that, right? But this is different, because what is happening now is we actually, if we admit Israel into the visa waiver program, we're seeking to give Israel a privilege that it does not warrant, given that it cannot issue reciprocity to our US passports the same way that it would to others. So we do believe that there's a different problem here with the equal protection issue. And I'm eager to have the conversation with some questions and answers. I didn't want to take up too much time. There are two final points that I want to make. What does reciprocity mean? That's a real problem, and that is actually not clearly defined. And we don't have, we collect the anecdotal information, but our own government does not have the data on how many from our community, how many Arab Americans and others have been denied entry into Israel. That data is not available to us. Israel does not make that data available. So how does one determine reciprocity is really central to this discussion. And the second point I want to make is, it's one I found ironic when Israel's refusal rate was the initial barrier. Members of Congress started talking about, well, can we create the Israel exception, as they often do? And there was a discussion about changing the refusal rate for Israel so that they would be, potentially eligible into the program. The good news is certainly that didn't happen. That's fine. The recent letter that was circulating among members of Congress to support admitting Israel into the visa waiver program specifically was about economic advantages. So it talked about, there are roughly 450,000 arrivals from the state of Israel. On average, the assumption is that they would spend $1.6 billion. So it was about an economic argument that was being put forward. And that's why we should do this. No mention at all in the letter about their treatment of US citizens of Arab descent. What was interesting about it, though, is that they used that data, the economic data from the US Travel Association. Pretty benign sounding kind of thing. They just want people to increase their travel, increase economic opportunity. That's great. The funny part of it is the fact sheet that is issued by the US Travel Association, when they explain why these different countries aren't part of the visa waiver program, under Israel, it says reason for exclusion. I'm going to quote on this because I think it's useful to read. Israel has been kept out of the visa waiver program for mostly political reasons. And I quote, they refuse to give Palestinian Americans visa travel into Israel. So even the very entities that are advocating for these programs have gone on record, like our own State Department has gone on record, basically saying Israel does not and will not have reciprocity agreements with regards to US citizens of Arab descent. And again, there's the reason I said we shouldn't be having this conversation is that doesn't seem to be up for debate. The new rules they intended to put in place in May, and now I understand that later this summer, are just another example of codifying into policy and law what they've been doing arbitrarily for decades, which is that they will not honor U.S. passport holders if they are Arab Americans, Palestinian Americans, or others who advocate for Palestinian human rights. I'll stop there.
Maya, thank you so much. And incredible, forgive me for not knowing about the link, and I will definitely include it. ADC will include that in the email that goes out. It's extremely helpful to have. Thank you for sharing it. I mean, I have stories to share with you all as well. So that's excellent. I think it's also important to note that the Palestinians or Palestinian Americans are, the discrimination against us is so severe because so many of us are under different labels. Like some of us are West Bank, some of us are East Jerusalem, some of us, our parents are West Bank, our children are other, and that is by design. We are restricted from traveling in the same cars in Palestine. If you're from Jerusalem, you have a blue ID, and if you're from West Bank, you have a different color ID. So this is a system thing. This is systemic, and it's not just exclusive to our travel as Americans, but also Palestinians in Palestine face this on a daily basis. And it's incredible to hear and to watch and to experience. And that's where a lot of the questions are coming from. I'm just going to give a brief example. Zaha, I'm going to direct my first question to you, and this is a personal one, and then we're going to open it up because I know I've gotten a lot of questions that are similar to mine. My family, my mother and my father, first, relatives, as you had explained, both have Jerusalem ID cards, right? My husband and my children have West Bank ID cards. My Jerusalem ID was revoked, so I was expelled from Palestine. I only have an American passport. My question is as follows, or questions. Do I enter through, first of all, if I'm traveling by myself, do I enter through the airport or do I enter through the Jisr, through the bridge? And do I need to fill out a document? And if I am traveling with my children who have West Bank IDs, do I travel through the bridge or do I travel through the airport? And it's complicated, I know, but they make it that way. This is the racist system that we live in right now. So Zaha, please.
Yeah,
and then we'll answer, I'll turn it over to Chris and we'll answer more of the questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, when I first started looking at the COGAT rules, it took me a week because I had to sort of map out like how this whole thing was operating. But before I get to your very, very complicated question and try to figure out what would happen for you, where you would be allowed to travel, or what port of entry, I just want to say something on what Maya was saying about the response from U.S. officials that, Israel has a right to exclude whomever it wants from its sovereign territory. Okay. I mean, the US does that too. I mean, the US excludes people all of the time, and it is considered a sovereign right. So is the US accepting that the occupied territories are part of Israel's sovereign borders when it says that? Because Israel's certainly treating them as its sovereign borders. That's why, if you look at the COGAT rules, it's talking about Judea and Samaria as part of its territory. And it's talking about, it doesn't mention Israeli citizens and those visiting Israeli residents of Judea and Samaria as having issues when they want to enter. Those people can enter freely because Israel considers Judea and Samaria part of its territory, and it can determine who gets to come in and visit family and who doesn't. So I really think that that U.S. officials should be called out on that if that's their response. If their response is Israel's, this is like any sovereign would do. And I also want to point out that it is actually well established in Israel the bases for denying somebody entry. But some of those reasons include, there's a laundry list, but some of the reasons are like, you appear to be someone who might have some kind of entrenched connection to the area, or you're a security threat, which how Israel applies security threats, how it determines a security threat. If you're a Palestinian in general, you're a demographic threat, which is a threat to Israel's national security. if you're engaged in BDS activity, as Maya said, I mean, that's a basis for exclusion on the books. It's not like they just randomly apply that. That's actually their law. And another catch-all is any other relevant consideration, Israel can exclude somebody, whether it's from Allenby or from, the Tel Aviv airport. So, I mean, this is what we're dealing with. And one of the issues that I have with the, with all of this is that this has been going on for quite some time. And we all know it has been. And the State Department in its reports has always, mentioned these issues. But we don't have public information, correct me, Maya, if I'm wrong. We don't have public information about how many American citizens are excluded by Israel every year. And I really think that's so critical. And I would love to know like where they are excluded from, because most or many Palestinians will want to travel through Allenby. So how many American citizens are excluded at the Allenby crossing, and how many American citizens are excluded at Ben Gurion? And if there's any information on their identities, that would even be better. I don't think there would be, but there should be some data on the numbers. Now back to your question. So let's think about this. And I think we talked about it before, but now I'm having to like go back in my memory. So let's think about this. Your husband, is your husband traveling with you, and your children, are they traveling with you?
So no, let's say no.
Let's say no, they're not, you're traveling alone. Okay, well, your husband's center of living is not the West Bank, and he's not going to be currently in the West Bank when you travel there, right? And your parents are from Jerusalem, right? So if I was you, I would go, whichever port of entry you want to go to, but you're not traveling to visit a Palestinian ID holder then. You're traveling to visit someone who's a resident of Jerusalem. So you can go in you don't have to get pre-clearance, and you can travel through any port of entry.
If I'm traveling with my children who have Palestinian ID cards because of their father.
If you're traveling with your children who have Palestinian IDs, their center of living is not the West Bank, and they're not they're going to be currently in the West Bank when you travel. That's an interesting question. So I don't know the answer to that. So these are part of the crazy kinds of considerations that Palestinian Americans will have to think about when they travel, before they travel. So this is why it's so important to get clarity from, from Israeli authorities, from the State Department about exactly how is this going to be applied.
Yep. And part of the reason why this is so important, because it's not just a matter of reporting this to, or having this conversation just to prove a point. This will actually happen, and we will be returned from ports of entry to visit parents so this is not a gotcha question. This is actually reality, and I'm not an exception. I'm one of many who are facing the exact same thing, and questions are all over about this. I'm going to turn it over to Chris, who has been incredible at compiling all the incredible questions that have come in and the various ones, and he will help moderate them and go through them with you all. Chris?
Thank you so much. This has all been incredibly informative. I'm learning things that I wish I never had to learn. So we've gotten a number of questions. Thank you to everybody who submitted their questions beforehand. I've been tracking them here in the chat and in the Q&A. If you do have a question, please feel free, put it in the chat, put it in the Q&A. We'll do our best to get to as many as we can. I'll go with Zaha first. A lot of the questions have been about traveling within either the 45 days within the 45 days after these rules get implemented, or if somebody has travel planned before they get implemented. What are the restrictions that these individuals might want to consider?
So like I said, a lot of these rules already exist on the books, or they're unwritten rules. And so if you're traveling before the effective date, with the postponement now that we have on them to July 5th, if you're traveling before July 5th, you still have to deal with the old rules. And like I said, if you look at the State Department website, they're linking you to the Israeli rules that relate to pre-screening for COVID during the COVID period. And again, the application asks you the same intrusive and invasive questions that you will find in the new rules. So in some ways, but one thing I will say is the requirement about providing this application applies only to Allenby crossing. So if you can travel through Ben Gurion, you wouldn't have to do this application. It's only if you're traveling through Ben Gurion that anybody, supposedly anybody, would have to do this pre-screening and submit it to the Israeli embassy or consulate. So it's not that you get away. The only way to get away from having to do that at this point would be if you were traveling through Ben Gurion.
Awesome, thank you. So another similar to Zaina's question, and I'm hoping that we might be able to give a little bit of just clarity on it. People traveling with a spouse, with just a friend, whoever it may be, that are Hawiyah holders that have the Palestinian ID and they do not. Is there any sort of generalized, hey, this is a better option? Crossing through Jordan is a better option than flying into Tel Aviv?
I mean, some people aren't going to have an option, like those categories of people I told you about. If you're only going to the West Bank, then you are subject to those rules, and you will have to go through Allenby and you will have to do the pre-screening. Now, if you are planning to stay in both Israel and the West Bank or occupied East Jerusalem, then you can go through the airport, or you could go through Allenby too, and you don't have to do the pre-screening because you're just a tourist at that point. So, I mean, it seems bizarre and crazy and all this, but I mean, that's the way the rules are written currently. So, yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. Another follow-up to that, if an individual goes to the Israeli border and they're asking them questions about the reasons for their travel, and they have multiple reasons. So one person who submitted a question said that they're traveling to participate in a Palestinian summer youth program, but they're also traveling to visit family. Is there, from what we know now, at least, is there a better answer to give, or it's a roll of the dice either way?
I'm not going to advise.
No, not as it totally as a.
But I will say that there is no basis under the rules for someone going in for a youth program. It's only college students and folks at that level that can get special permits to go in for those reasons. So if you're a young person who wants to go to the occupied territories with your family to visit, or just go alone to visit, you don't have a right to do that. You'd have to get special permission under these rules to do that. Okay. And it has to be for humanitarian. It has to be for humanitarian
with
reasons.
all the relevant restrictions, because of course, why would you be able to just travel to visit? Let's see. I actually have a question for Maya. When we talk about these dual Palestinian American citizens, it's my understanding that Israel currently treats the Palestinian ID as the primary piece of identification for an individual with dual citizenship. Can you just talk a little bit about that primacy issue?
Sure. And if I may, Chris, I just want to make one point on when I concluded my remarks. What Zaina had to offer was really important to understand. I'm restricting my remarks specifically to Israel's viability in terms of entering the visa waiver program. There is no question about its long record of human rights abuses internally within the occupied territories and at its borders. So just my comments are very specific to the US policy with regards to this visa waiver program piece. And then just an additional point about something someone sent in the chat, the specific guidance on from the State Department currently, it's changed multiple times throughout, and we have screenshots for different versions of it. So we know what it was historically, what it currently is. But it currently says some US citizens of Arab or Muslim heritage. I don't quite know what Muslim heritage is, but I think they mean Muslims. So US citizens of Muslim, Arab or Muslim heritage, including Palestinian Americans, have experienced significant difficulties and unequal and occasionally hostile treatment at Israel's borders and checkpoints. So to the comment that was made that they've also targeted Muslims, that's certainly the case, and the State Department does acknowledge that. So just wanted to mention that. The issue of Palestinian ID cards versus US passport holders and not allowing the individual American to make that determination is yet another example of how they disregard US citizenship. If a person of Palestinian American is traveling and has a US passport and they want to enter through the US passport, or they don't even have a Palestinian ID card, they don't want to get a Palestinian ID card, it's simply not, I mean, there have been many that have been barred entry because of that. And it's just another example of how they apply a different set of rules to Palestinian Americans. And again, it's tons of abhorrent practices that play out. But the point here, though, is that you do not privilege them with an entry into a program when they've treated Americans this way.
Thank you so much.
Chris, just a point here, and I think it was mentioned also previously, but even if you, for those who aren't familiar with this process over years, even if you do get a visa, even if you do abide by everything that is being told here and all of this stuff, you can still be denied entry and you can still be harassed, no matter if you follow everything to the T, just to make that point to those who are just listening to get information. Back to you, Chris. Thanks.
That's a
I
fantastic point.
That because I see a lot of questions about, you know, what if you have family and you're really going to see family, but you know, you also are wanting to go to, you know, to Jerusalem or to Israel, you know, are you still restricted and you can't travel through Ben Gurion? I was, you know, I'm trying to think about how this would play out, you know, in real time. You know, you show up at the airport and they ask you, because they've always asked this question, and I've never quite known why they were asking this question. You know, they asked the question of like, so where are you planning to visit? Are you planning to visit in Israel? And the answer, you know, you answer the question. Now I understand, like, this was probably why they were asking this throughout that time, and now it's become even more relevant with these new COGAT rules. They're asking because they want to know, like, are you really, you have family there, and that's where, you know, that's where you'll be staying. So if you really plan to go to both areas, which most people do. I mean, most American visitors aren't just going to stay in the West Bank. I mean, they want to go to Jerusalem, they want to go, you know. So how I think this would play out now is in order to enforce these rules, is they might at the airport say, well, let me, you know, and sometimes they do this, let me see your hotel reservation, or give me the address of where you're staying in Israel or Jerusalem, and then they'll call, and they do call. And, you know, but if they see that you also have a first-degree relative, I'm thinking that they may not just believe you, you know, or they may just decide some other relevant consideration that they're allowed, or if they believe that you're actually going to entrench yourself in the West Bank or something, and they'll deny you entry. They can do that, and they've done that under the previous rules. So that's what I think would happen, because, you know, we do have this idea of if you're engaged in a parallel visit to both Israel and the West Bank, then you're supposed to be allowed free entry without pre-screening. But you know, that's just to allow for tourism, you know, so they want to continue to have tourists come from Jordan and not be obstructed. So that's what that's for. It's not meant for you know, American Palestinians who are visiting family in the West Bank, but who also want to visit Israel. So that's my guess is how it will play out at the airport if you just show up at the airport and then they start questioning you and then they find out that you do have family.
Thank you. So there's another question here in the chat, and it kind of goes into how I'm trying to process all this. Do these new rules have any impact on those in Gaza, those with family in Gaza, but not in the West Bank? How do these rules treat Gazans?
These rules are for the West Bank. Judea and
Okay.
Samaria is what the title of
Yeah.
the ordinances. So it does not apply to Gaza, and we know Gaza is closed and blockaded and has its
Yes.
own set of issues and problems for Americans trying to visit or, stay there.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. Let's see, what else have we gotten in? So a lot of the questions have been about the intrusive nature of what people might be asked either in their screenings or at the border. And I think this question probably goes more to Maya than it does to Zaha, but what options are available to U.S. citizens, whether they be dual or solely U.S. citizens, when asked to submit cell phones or laptops for search?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point in this process, because that is something that is also in our State Department warnings, that they will often ask for access to your social media or your email. And I think, I don't recall who in the chat was pointing out how arbitrary the denials are. So it's a simple, if, like we all would, respecting our own privacy, decline such a thing, because what an extraordinary request and violation to suggest that they should have access to our private devices or data on those devices. Any denial of that could result in a denial of entry. In fact, I honestly believe there are times when folks are like, here, look at everything, and you're still denied entry. It's simply about the arbitrary nature of this. And again, the rule is about reciprocity. If you can't meet reciprocity, you're not eligible for this program.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to keep going through what we have here. Here's a good one. So Zaha, can you do your best and try to explain that the Population and Immigration Authority procedure referred to in this ordinance that applies to foreigners wishing to visit both Israel and the West Bank? Might be a little bit specific.
No. So that's a reference to sort of the general entry requirements for anybody traveling to Israel. And I listed some of the reasons for exclusion, that those reasons for exclusions are included in that law. And you can find it on the Israeli government website. Actually, I do think that is only in Hebrew. So I don't know if it's translated, but in any case, it lists, I don't know, maybe 16, something like that, bases for exclusion, including this catch-all at the end of any relevant consideration, you can be denied. So it's pretty, the officials at Israeli ports of entry have wide discretion to deny someone entry.
Thank you. A question here from Abigail: do these rules apply to clergy, priests, nuns, ministers, etc.? I heard you speak about the educational side of things, college students, professors. What about clergy?
Absolutely. One of the most egregious cases that we collected back from 2018, actually, was a group of clergymen who were traveling back, who were traveling to visit, and their treatment was extraordinary. Hours upon hours of isolation, and then denied entry, harassment. I mean, it was a pretty bad example of the way. So I don't think anybody is protected from these rules.
Thank you. I'm going to keep going through and see. We're getting a lot of questions now about what all of us can do to help put pressure to take action to to stop or reverse this ordinance and these discriminatory actions. I'm going to let Zaina kind of take the lead on that. Zaina.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Chris and Maya and Zaha. We discussed this a little bit earlier, and I think after this, like I mentioned earlier, after this, we'll be sending a follow-up email. I know ADC will, with all of the information discussed, hopefully helpful information, but we still do want to encourage everybody to contact their members of Congress. You don't need to be an expert on the details. You just have to make sure to let them know about the discrimination that you've learned about, and that if you are a Palestinian American or an American who will be faced with these decisions, to discuss the discrimination that is Palestinian Americans are being faced with. They need to know, and then they need to make put the pressure on the Israelis to actually change this procedure. So, as well as what Maya had put earlier in the chat, there's a link to submit all your information. And again, this is not just to collect numbers. This is so important for our narrative, so important for our advocacy, so important to humanize the issue. We're not just visas and blue ID cards and red ID cards and yellow ID. This is essential. Every one of us, each one of our experiences needs to be documented, and each infraction by the Israelis needs to be held accountable one way or another, not rewarded by a visa waiver program or by exceptionalism or funding even, but that's for a whole different issue and a topic that we can keep going on and on about. We will definitely follow up with a comprehensive email for all of your advocacy. We do need your voice. It's so important you are here learning about this and not just about this. One thing I want to mention, if you have the time and the ability and the will to participate in this effort and lend a hand an hour or two a week to this effort, because it takes a lot of time and energy from people, please contact the ADC and Chris or Maya or Zahat. We need all hands on deck. Even if you're a graphic designer and have ideas, if you're a writer and want to edit, if you are great at compiling things, please let us know. We can always use volunteers and help in this, and we need all hands on deck and on other issues as well. Chris, I think we have a few more minutes left. Should we take one more question, or should we? I think it would be good to maybe answer a question or two, maybe quick ones here.
I just suggest one thing before you go to a question. I just want to flag for people, or maybe you could flag for people, Zaina, that there are efforts underway at letters from members of Congress.
Yes, thank you. Well, we were still in the works. There have been members of Congress who were approached to support this initiative and this effort. They are still reviewing documents and working on them. And hopefully when this email is sent out, we will have concrete letters where you will be able to ask your members of Congress to endorse letters with specifics to the Department of State or the Department of Homeland Security, or even to the Israelis. So there will be more direct asks, hopefully from members of Congress to initiate it. And if you don't see a letter, maybe ask your own member of Congress to initiate something, to reach out to ADC and to AAI, to Maya and to Zaha, and to say, you know what, I would like to learn more about this, and help write a letter, So so thank you, Maya, for Zaha, for reminding us about that, and we'll definitely send that in the email as it comes out.
If I may, Chris, thank you, Zaina.
Yeah.
I just this is the summer travel that comes up. I cannot, as Zaina said, the narratives of our individual complaints have been instrumental in the past in blocking this. I'm not overstating it. It has been a key element when we've taken our documents and shared with them. These are the individual stories. Our complaint form allows you to say, yes, you can share it with press, or no, we absolutely honor your choice on remaining anonymous or not. So during these months now, it's incredibly important that we share as much as possible about what we know is going to happen, because what we didn't talk about is that the US ambassador's timeline for this is ideally by the fall. There's a conversation about we'd like to see something happen this year, potentially in September. Again, I hate when people hold things up on Zoom calls, because I think it's silly, but I'm going to do this. This is literally the fact sheet that is being used to lobby in support of admitting Israel into the visa waiver program. And it declares unequivocally, they refuse to give Palestinian Americans visa-free travel into Israel. So if the lobbying information contains this as a factual matter, it's upon us to demand that our government not allow something like this to move forward. So it's a really important data collection period, and the more that we get during this period, the more we can go back and demonstrate just how unequivocally unacceptable this entire conversation is.
And one quick point to add to all of this incredible conversation, just to show how egregious this is, and it was mentioned also earlier, I think it was by Zaha, Judea and Samaria. Settlements are a war crime. So if they're including the settlements and land annexation in this whole conversation as Israel, then we've moved into a whole different conversation. And that's also against US policy. You know, this is not just, you know, Palestinian ideology. The US policy is the West Bank is not part of Israel. And we can debate that, you know, but so they're varying on US policy. And just an asterisk here, settlements are a war crime. So Chris, back to you. Thank you again, Zaha and Maya, so very much for this. Thank you everyone for joining us. It's been an honor moderating this and a heartbreaking and truly heartbreaking to sit and read all the questions. Wish we had more time to answer them, but I've learned a lot, and hopefully we can mobilize on this. Please reach out if you have any questions to any of us. And thanks again to the ADC for hosting. Go ahead, Chris.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you, Zaha. Thank you, Maya. This has been incredible. Like I've put in the chat, in our follow-up email, we will be including the full document, links to get involved, what you can do now, and what we're looking to do in the future. Again, ADC was very proud to host this event, and we hope that we can continue to work together to achieve justice, both here in the States and in the occupied Palestinian territories. So with that, I'm gonna wrap up. Thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your evening.